Kendra Thorne settled into seat 12F, her worn leather jacket folded carefully in her lap. The red-eye flight from Phoenix to Boston stretched ahead like a quiet tunnel through the night. Around her, business travelers typed frantically on laptops, while families juggled crying babies and scattered snacks across narrow tray tables. She closed her eyes, letting the familiar hum of twin engines wash over her. Most passengers found the sound unsettling, a reminder they were suspended 6 miles above Earth in an aluminum tube. For Kendra, it felt like coming home. Her fingers unconsciously traced the faded calluses on her palms, remnants of countless hours gripping control sticks in cockpits most people would never see. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, checking seat belts with practiced efficiency. Margaret Chen had worked these routes for 12 years, and she prided herself on reading passengers. The woman in 12F seemed different somehow. While others fidgeted with phones or stared anxiously out windows, this passenger appeared completely at ease, as if she belonged in the sky. Before we continue this journey together, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed quiet courage in your own community, the kind that hides in plain sight until the moment it's needed most. Captain Rex Holloway adjusted his headset as Flight 447 climbed through 28,000 feet. The Boeing 737 responded smoothly to his inputs, engines purring with mechanical precision. Beside him, First Officer Diana Walsh monitored instruments with the methodical attention of someone fresh from flight school. Holloway had logged over 15,000 hours in commercial aviation, but tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the unusual headwind patterns air traffic control kept reporting, or perhaps the subtle vibration he'd noticed during takeoff. Nothing alarming, just the kind of detail that separated veteran pilots from rookies. In the cabin, Kendra shifted slightly in her seat, her subconscious mind cataloging every sound and sensation. The slight yaw in the aircraft's attitude, the barely perceptible change in engine harmonics, the way the flight attendants moved with just a fraction more purpose than usual. She opened her eyes briefly, scanning the cabin with practiced assessment. Elderly couple in 8A and 8B holding hands nervously. College student in 15C wearing noise-canceling headphones, oblivious to everything. Business executive in 4D already 3 drinks deep, trying to numb his fear of flying. Margaret Chen noticed the woman in 12F seemed more alert now, her gaze sweeping the cabin like someone accustomed to situational awareness. There was something military about her posture, the way she held herself ready even while appearing relaxed. The first warning light flickered on the instrument panel at 31,000 feet. Captain Holloway's eyes snapped to the amber hydraulic pressure indicator, his 20-year career instantly shifting in a high alert mode. He tapped the gauge gently, hoping for a false reading. The light stayed on. First Officer Walsh leaned forward, her training manual fresh in memory. Primary hydraulic system showing intermittent pressure loss, she announced quietly, not wanting to alarm the cabin crew listening on intercom. Holloway nodded grimly and began running through emergency checklists with methodical precision. In seat 12F, Kendra felt the subtle change before anyone else noticed. The aircraft trim shifted almost imperceptibly, requiring tiny corrections from the autopilot. Her eyes opened fully now, no longer feigning sleep. She knew that feeling, the way an aircraft behaves when hydraulic systems start failing. Margaret Chen moved through the cabin with practiced calm, but Kendra caught the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she glanced toward the cockpit door more frequently than normal. Flight attendants were trained to mask their concerns, but someone with military experience could read the signs. The businessman in 4D ordered another scotch, completely unaware that his biggest worry should no longer be turbulence. The elderly couple continued their quiet conversation about visiting grandchildren in Boston, blissfully ignorant of the amber warning light casting shadows across the cockpit instruments. Boston Center, Flight 447 requesting priority handling. Captain Holloway transmitted with controlled urgency. We're showing hydraulic system anomalies and need vectors for immediate approach to Logan. The air traffic controller's voice crackled back through static. Flight 447, understand hydraulic issues. Current weather at Logan shows crosswinds gusting to 35 knots. Recommend divert to Hartford Bradley with better conditions. Negative, Boston Center. We're losing pressure fast. Need Logan now. First Officer Walsh's hands moved across backup system switches while sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool cabin temperature. Secondary hydraulics showing fluctuations too, she reported quietly. This is escalating beyond standard emergency procedures. Kendra unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, stretching casually to avoid drawing attention. She walked toward the lavatory, but her real purpose was reconnaissance. Through the galley area, she could see Margaret Shun and another flight attendant huddled in urgent whispered conversation. Their body language screamed controlled panic. The college student in 15C finally removed his headphones, sensing something different in the cabin's atmosphere. The elderly woman in 8B clutched her husband's arm tighter, her maternal instincts picking up on subtle changes the younger passengers missed. Outside the small windows, city lights began appearing far below, still dozens of miles from their intended destination. The aircraft shuddered violently as Captain Holloway wrestled with increasingly unresponsive flight controls. Both primary and secondary hydraulic systems were failing simultaneously, a scenario that existed only in worst-case emergency training simulations. The backup manual reversion system engaged with a mechanical thunk that resonated throughout the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some technical difficulties and will be making an unscheduled landing in Boston. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and follow all crew instructions. His voice remained steady, but First Officer Walsh could see the strain in his white-knuckled grip on the control yoke. She had never seen him struggle this hard to maintain level flight. The aircraft wanted to roll left continuously, requiring constant physical pressure to keep wings level. Margaret Shin moved through the cabin preparing passengers for emergency landing procedures, her professional smile masking growing terror. She noticed the woman from 12F had returned to her seat, but now sat completely upright, alert, watching everything with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. Kendra's mind raced through emergency scenarios she had faced in different aircraft, different circumstances. Hydraulic failure in combat zones. Deadstick landings on damaged runways. The muscle memory of crisis management flooded back as she assessed their deteriorating situation with clinical precision that 20 years of military aviation had burned into her reflexes. Emergency vehicles screamed across Logan Airport's tarmac as Flight 447 approached on vectors that painted a terrifying picture on radar screens. The aircraft's descent rate was too steep, its approach angle too unstable for a normal landing. Fire trucks positioned themselves along runway 4, or while ambulances waited with engines running. In the cockpit, Captain Holloway's arms ached from fighting the manual controls. Every minor input required enormous physical strength, and the aircraft responded with dangerous delays. First Officer Walsh called out airspeed and altitude readings that grew more alarming with each passing second. "We're coming in too fast and too steep," she reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. "I can't get the nose up enough for proper flare." The cabin had grown eerily quiet except for muffled crying from the back rows. Passengers gripped armrests and each other, sensing they were beyond routine emergency procedures. The college student stared out his window at the approaching runway lights, finally understanding why everyone looked so frightened. Kendra unbuckled her seatbelt again and moved toward the front of the cabin with deliberate purpose. Margaret Shun intercepted her near row 6, placing a firm hand on her arm. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately and prepare for emergency landing." The flight attendant commanded with professional authority that barely masked her own terror at their rapidly deteriorating situation. Captain Holloway's voice broke through the cabin speakers with barely controlled desperation. "Ladies and gentlemen, We need all available assistance. If anyone on board has pilot experience, any flight experience at all, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately. The announcement sent shock waves through the passenger compartment. The businessman in 4D sobered instantly, his scotch forgotten. The elderly couple clutched each other tighter, understanding that their situation had moved beyond critical. Even seasoned travelers knew that pilots never made such requests unless facing catastrophic circumstances. Margaret Chin stared at Kendra with sudden recognition, remembering her unusual composure, her military bearing, the way she seemed to understand aircraft systems. "Ma'am, do you have flying experience?" she asked urgently. Kendra met her eyes with steady confidence. 22 years, United States Air Force. Fighter jets, cargo planes, combat zones. I can help them. The flight attendant's professional skepticism warred with desperate hope. This ordinary-looking woman in economy class, claiming military aviation credentials, seemed impossible, yet something about her absolute calm in crisis spoke of genuine experience. Around them, other passengers leaned forward, catching fragments of conversation that might determine whether they lived or died. First Officer Walsh's voice crackled over the intercom again, strain evident in every word. "We're losing altitude too fast. Manual controls aren't responding properly." Margaret Chun escorted Kendra through the galley area toward the cockpit door, her hand trembling as she knocked. "Captain, we have a passenger claiming Air Force pilot experience," she announced through the reinforced barrier. The cockpit door opened to reveal Captain Holloway's sweat-drenched face and First Officer Walsh's wide-eyed terror. Both pilots looked skeptical as they saw an ordinary woman in civilian clothes, but desperation overrode doubt when another violent shudder shook the aircraft. "What's your background?" Holloway demanded while wrestling the control yoke. Lieutenant Colonel Kendra Thorne, retired. F-16 Fighting Falcon, C-130 Hercules, combat deployments Iraq and Afghanistan. Instructor pilot at Luke Air Force Base for 8 years, she replied with crisp military precision. First Officer Walsh stared in disbelief. "You flew fighters?" Kendra stepped into the cramped cockpit space, instantly assessing instrument panels, control positions, system status displays. Her eyes moved with practiced efficiency across hydraulic pressure gauges, flight attitude indicators, engine parameters. The muscle memory of thousands of hours in military cockpits flooded back as she evaluated their critical situation. "We're in manual reversion with no hydraulic assist," she observed, her voice calm and analytical despite the aircraft's increasingly violent behavior. "What's your elevator authority?" Captain Holloway's relief was palpable as he recognized genuine aviation expertise in her assessment. Kendra slid into the jump seat behind the pilots, her hands already moving toward backup controls with muscle memory that transcended aircraft type. "Captain, I need you to reduce power to 60% and trim nose heavy. We're going to use gravity and airflow to our advantage instead of fighting the aircraft." Captain Holloway hesitated for a fraction of a second before following her instructions. The counterintuitive approach went against every instinct of commercial aviation training, but her confidence carried the authority of someone who had faced far worse situations. First Officer Walsh watched in amazement as the aircraft's violent bucking began to settle into a more controlled descent. "How did you know that would work?" she asked breathlessly. "Deadstick landings in combat zones," Kendra replied without taking her eyes off the instruments. "When you lose all systems, you learn to make the aircraft want to do what you need instead of forcing it." The runway lights of Logan Airport grew larger through the windscreen, but their approach angle remained dangerously steep. Ground proximity warnings began chiming insistently as they descended below minimum safe altitude for their distance from the runway. Boston Tower, Flight 447 requesting foam on the runway and all emergency equipment standing by, Captain Holloway transmitted. "We're committed to this approach with a military pilot assisting." Kendra's hands moved to the manual trim controls, making minute adjustments that seemed to coax cooperation from the rebellious aircraft. The runway rushed toward them at an alarming rate as Kendra called out precise instructions with combat pilot authority. Captain, hold steady pressure on the yoke. Diana, I need you to cut power to 40% on my mark, then full reverse thrust the instant we touch down. First Officer Walsh's hands hovered over the throttles, her training warring with terror as they descended below normal glide path parameters. Every instrument screamed warnings about their excessive descent rate and unstable approach angle. Now, Diana, power reduction, Kendra commanded with ice-cold precision. The engine spooled down just as the aircraft crossed the runway threshold. Captain Holloway felt the nose want to pitch down violently, but Kendra's hand joined his on the control yoke, adding her strength to his as they fought to keep the aircraft level. Flare now. Pull back together, she ordered. The Boeing 737 hit the runway harder than any commercial landing should, bouncing once before settling onto the tarmac with a jarring impact that rattled every rivet in the airframe. Reverse thrust screamed as the engines fought to slow their dangerous ground speed. Full brakes, Kendra shouted over the mechanical chaos. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft as it finally rolled to a stop just short of the runway's end, foam spraying across hot metal and smoking tires in the darkness of Logan Airport. Emergency chutes deployed with loud pops as passengers evacuated onto the foam-covered tarmac. Captain Holloway sat in stunned silence, his hands still gripping the control yoke as the reality of their survival began to sink in. First Officer Walsh turned to Kendra with tears streaming down her face. "You saved us all," she whispered. "Without you, we never would have made it." Kendra unbuckled from the jump seat with characteristic military composure, but her own hands trembled slightly as adrenaline finally began to fade. "Just doing what needed to be done," she replied quietly. Emergency personnel surrounded the aircraft while paramedics checked passengers for injuries. Margaret Chun found Kendra among the evacuees and grabbed her shoulders with fierce gratitude. "I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did in there." The elderly couple from 8A and 8B approached hesitantly, the woman clutching her husband's arm. "We heard what happened," she said softly. "Our granddaughter is getting married next weekend in Boston. Because of you, we'll be there to walk her down the aisle." Passengers began gathering around Kendra as word spread through the crowd about the mysterious woman in seat 12F who had emerged from anonymity to become their guardian angel. The college student, businessman, flight attendants, everyone whose lives had been saved by her hidden expertise. Television news crews arrived as dawn broke over Logan Airport, their cameras capturing the foam-covered Boeing 737 that had become a symbol of miraculous survival. Captain Holloway stood before reporters with Kendra beside him, no longer the anonymous passenger from seat 12F, but a decorated Air Force veteran whose quick thinking had prevented catastrophe. Lieutenant Colonel Kendra Thorne flew combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, served as an instructor pilot for 8 years, and tonight she proved that heroes can be found anywhere, even sleeping in economy class, Holloway announced to the gathered media. Airport officials presented Kendra with a commendation while passengers cheered from behind security barriers. The businessman from 4D shook her hand vigorously, thanking her for getting him home to his family. Margaret Chun hugged her tightly, whispering that she would never look at passengers the same way again. First Officer Walsh approached with tears in her eyes. "I'm going to recommend you for every civilian aviation honor that exists," she promised. "What you did tonight should be taught in every flight school in the country." Kendra smiled modestly, her military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. Sometimes ordinary people are asked to do extraordinary things. Tonight was just my turn to serve. If this story moved you, please drop a comment about what resonated most with you, or tell us about someone you know who showed hidden strength when it mattered most.